Okay, so this lecture is going to be about the anthroposphere or the Anthropocene. So when we say anthroposphere, we're specifically talking about the part of the Earth system, not the atmosphere, not the hydrosphere, the oceans, not the um, biosphere like the plants and the trees and stuff, but the anthroposphere, meaning the part of the Earth system that has been um, affected by humans, the human influence on the system. And sometimes that word, anthroposphere or Anthropocene, is used to describe the current geologic time that the Earth is in, the Anthropocene. This is a geologic period of Earth's history that is being influenced heavily by humans and human activity. And so a lot of scientists have started calling this period in Earth's history the Anthropocene to kind of denote that humans are having a very large impact on the environment that will show up if aliens or somebody digs in the rock millions of years in the future and wants to see the time periods of Earth. They'll see the Anthropocene as a signature in the rock layer of what humans did to the planet. Maybe it'll be like plastics or some radioactive material, that sort of thing. So here's a picture, a perfect example of what I mean by the Anthroposphere or the Anthropocene, right? So this is a rainforest that has been deliberately chopped down and then burned. The burning is to return some nutrients to the soil because they're eventually going to plant an oil palm plantation to grow palm oil, which is used as a solid fat at room temperature in things like Oreos and conditioner for your hair, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's what we mean by the Anthroposphere and the Anthropocene. So to understand the Anthroposphere and the Anthropocene, we need to understand the trajectory of human population throughout history. So for 2 to 3 million years, population of humans and human-like species remained very low because humans, and at the time they were not in the Homo genus, right? So we're Homo sapiens. So sort of proto-humans were Australopithecus, for example. There were some Homo erectus, other types of species, but Homo sapiens actually have only been around for the last 200,000 years. Okay, so for several million years, Homo sapiens and their predecessors, proto-humans, were living in a very tight-knit, tribal, hunter-gatherer structure of society. And then around 10,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, farming and livestock domestication were accidentally discovered by human beings. So humans realized that they could stay actually in the same place and farm their food rather than gathering it or hunting for it. They could just obtain it from a farm that they could plant themselves. So this allowed for the first population boom of humans. It allowed for the creation of cities, settlements, and towns, and then eventually cities, and all of the things that we now know as our society have happened since that agrarian revolution, since humans started farming. So the true explosion, however, in population really came about 200 to 300 years ago and was accelerated by both the industrial and the medical revolution. So the medical revolution was sort of catalyzed by our ability to better treat diseases and also cure diseases through antibiotics, vaccines, and those sorts of things. So that has allowed us to live longer, reproduce more, and our offspring are more likely to survive. And the quote-unquote industrial revolution, I hate calling it a revolution because that's fucked, but the advent of a fossil fuel economy also helped to catalyze a population explosion. So we've gone from a billion people to 7.5 billion people in a very, very, very short amount of time. And you can see on this chart, the population was growing and growing and growing and growing, and then it just really took off in the last 200, 300 years. Here's another way of looking at it. the axis here has been stretched out in an exponential way so that you can actually see when things rise. So we have early agriculture, and then you have the city, the advent of the city-state, and that allows for the first population boom. Then you have the era of empires. Things are kind of stagnant. You have the Black Plague and other things, and then you have, boom, the industrial and medical revolutions. Of course, there are a lot of people on the planet, but we're not evenly distributed across the planet. We live mostly in cities, mostly in settlements. So this map here shows the population density of humans. So the darker the red, the more people that live per square mile, per square kilometer, right? The lighter oranges are where it's more sparsely populated. So you can see in the U.S., you can very clearly see some of the major cities. You can see Chicago and Detroit, the Eastern Seaboard. You can see Toronto and Montreal and Los Angeles, etc. In parts of South Asia and East Asia, actually, the population density is very high over a much larger area, so the cities aren't as distinguished. I mean, you can see a couple of the cities here in southern China, but there's also just a lot of people everywhere. Okay, so population density is different. There's also some areas where nobody lives, like the middle of the Sahara and northern Siberia and Greenland and that sort of thing. I mentioned that people live in cities. People are increasingly living in cities. So even taking a very established city like New York, population in 1955 is about 13 million, and the population in 2015 is almost 20 million. Okay, so even New York City is growing. But other cities, other very large cities like Mexico City, in 1955 had about 3.8 million people, and now it has about 22 million people. So that city has really exploded. The same with Sao Paulo and Lagos and Cairo and Mumbai and even Tokyo. Okay, so people are globally increasingly moving to urban areas. Why would that be? Well, that's where all the resources are. Okay, so the resources are aggregated and distributed in these urban areas. So if you want to access those resources, whether it be jobs, food, shelter, security, ideology, you want to be in a city. So most of the global population will eventually be living in cities instead of vice versa. So we're not moving from cities back to rural areas or any of that. We're moving to more and more dense living environments, and that actually could be a good thing if we're trying to address climate change. But when we think about the anthroposphere and the Anthropocene, which is the human impact on the environment, we need to consider that most humans actually live in these really, really, really compacted, densely populated urban areas. But that said, our influence on the Earth extends well beyond those populated urban areas. So you can see here, this is a map showing the human influence on the Earth, and there's no number scale, it's just low to high. So where it's low, that's the blues, and where it's high, well, where it's negligible, that's black colored. Where it's low, that's like blues, high is red. So you can see that obviously where there are cities, there's a huge impact of humans on the Earth. Like our natural environment is almost all planned and planted. We're covered in concrete, there are buildings and skyscrapers, etc. But our influence extends well beyond those urban boundaries. You can see, for example, here in North America, there's a large stretch of land here that's really sparsely populated, right? If we return to this, right? So it's very sparsely populated here, but a fairly high influence, and that's because of one really important thing that people do, which is farm. We are farmers. Humans are farmers through and through. If you remember nothing else from this lecture, remember that humans really are at the core of everything, right? We are a farming species. We haven't always been a farming species, but we are a farming species, and our existence and our way of life is defined by our ability to farm. So a lot of these areas here where maybe humans don't actually live, their influence is high because they are farming the planet. They're tearing down whatever ecosystem was there and replacing it with a monoculture, corn, soy, other crops, okay? So farming is a humongous way in which human beings influence the planet. And so on that note, let's look at where the croplands are, okay? So here's a map showing cropland intensity. Obviously brown is where there's more intense farming. Orange and light orange is where it's like slightly less intense. But you can see that even though people are really concentrated in cities, although there is some spacing out of people across the landscape, the farms are everywhere, and there are a lot of farms. There are a lot of cropland. So just looking here in the Midwest, look at the intensity of farming here in the corn and wheat belts. Corn, beans, and wheat belt, right, up through Canada. Same in Western Russia and Eastern Europe. Northern India on the Ganges River, hugely intense, densely populated farming region. One of the real devastating impacts of all this farming is that we have, over time, really degraded the soil. So in some parts of the world, the soil was already really close to being degraded. In the tropics, for example, the soil is very precarious. There's not a lot of nutrients to start with, and then if you farm for 1 or 2 years, then your soil is useless. Okay, so here's a map showing where there is degraded and very degraded soil in the orange and the red, and you can see that it overlaps with a lot of those croplands. So we have really degraded the soil to the point where it's almost unfarmable in some areas. This is a huge problem because our population continues to grow, and that population is only going to survive if it's able to be fed. And so we have to feed it by farming. And so one way that we address this problem of degraded soil is we fertilize. So we fertilize the farmland, the pastures, the crops, to get them to grow shit the next year, right? So now we're adding all this fertilizer onto this degraded soil. Much of this fertilizer is created synthetically in a lab. There are very few naturally occurring ways in nature that fertilizer can be created. But in a fertilizer plant, it's fairly easy. So we pump out the synthetic fertilizer, we dump it on the degraded soil, and we can grow a crop the next year. Now, what that does to the surrounding ecosystem, to the air, to the atmosphere, to the climate, to the rivers, to the drinking water, to the aquifers, whatever, it's all bad. Well, not all bad, but it's generally bad. But at least we can grow those crops, I guess. So we have degraded soil and fertilizer. That's like kind of number one thing that I want to hammer home about the Anthropocene, is the way in which we are impacting the actual soil of the planet through our over-farming. We've also torn down a lot of forests to make room for farms and for people, but more recently it's been farms. So everywhere that forests have been lost is in the red, okay? And everywhere that they are still intact is in the green. And so you can see, like in North America, maybe not a ton of forest loss. There was a lot of forest lost on the East Coast, but it's since grown back. But we have a lot of forest loss surrounding, for example, the Congo and in the Amazon, in Europe and in East and Southern Asia. So there has been a lot of forest loss. Forests are really important part of the global ecosystem. They're sometimes considered the lungs of the planet. So the loss of forests is very problematic for our survival as a species. They provide a lot of things for humans that humans use, and they are just a critical and integral part of our survival of the Earth, maintaining a healthy ecosystem. Here's another map for your reference, which shows where forest has been lost or degraded, and then where it actually grew back in some cases. One of the places where the forest has, where forest loss has been most devastating has been in the Amazon and in Brazil in particular. And we'll have another lecture on this, specifics of this. But here we have a map showing the original forest cover, okay? And then here we have a map showing the current forest cover. So you can see all the light blue is where there was forest and there no longer is forest. And then the tannish colors here show where there's fragmented forests, meaning that there is still some forest intact, but there's also some roads, some settlements, and some farmland, and some grazing land, okay? So the Amazon, you can see this is the Amazon rainforest here, and you can see how farming and logging is just moving in at, and has been for many years, at a quick pace, where it's slowly eating away at the Amazon rainforest. Forests are also important, and not just forests, but all biomes are important, especially if they're what we consider a biodiversity hotspot. So biodiversity hotspots are places where the forest or the grassland or the ecosystem is particularly diverse in terms of the number and type of species that are present. So one of these biodiversity hotspots, for example, is California. California has a very unique ecosystem. There are a lot of species that are really highly adapted to survival, whether it be during a wildfire or a drought or fog or a desert ecosystem. California is considered one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. Same with the Mediterranean and the Horn of Africa, for example, and the southern plains of Brazil, the western side of the Andes Mountains, and the rainforest in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, a biodiversity hotspot. So these are really, really critically important for the health of the global ecosystem, and they also provide a lot of things that humans use, medicines, food, and other things that are really important to our survival as a species, let alone the whole planet's survival as an ecosystem. But when you overlap that map with the areas that humans have decided should be protected from human influence, you can see there's not a ton of overlap. There's also not a ton of protected areas on the planet. There should be a lot more than this. But these are, this is a rough depiction of where the protected areas are on the planet. And there are not very many of them. And for many of the ones that do exist, they're not particularly well enforced, okay, especially in the Amazon, and especially with the right-wing president of Brazil. So there's a lot to be said about whether we should protect areas or not, whether protecting areas is actually another form of human influence. That's a debate that we can and should have, but I will just say there's not a lot of overlap between biodiversity hotspots. There's not a lot of overlap between where forests have been lost, and there just aren't a lot of protected areas, national parks, national preserves, that sort of thing. So if you combine all of that, okay, the biodiversity and the influence that humans have on water availability, whether it be increasing drought, or we live in drought regions, or we just don't have the economic infrastructure in some areas to clean water, making it acceptable for human consumption. When you combine those, much of the planet is actually threatened by a loss of biodiversity or the existence of water scarcity. So the yellow indicates regions that are at threat. There's a grave threat to biodiversity, but not as big of a threat to human water scarcity. The brown is the opposite, where there's a threat to water scarcity, but not a huge threat to biodiversity. And the red is when there's a threat to both. And you can see there's a lot of red on this map. Africa, East and South Asia, parts of Europe and Central Asia, South America, the Caribbean, right? So these are all areas where not only is there a threat of water scarcity, but there's also a threat to biodiversity, and the combination of those two things could be truly devastating. So another kind of big part of the Anthropocene and the Anthroposphere is this effect that humans have on biodiversity and water availability. It all boils down to how many resources humans consume. And humans consume a lot of resources, okay, just because of our very existence. So here's a map showing where things are consumed. So let me rephrase that. This is a map showing how many kilograms of carbon per year, grams of carbon per year, are consumed in a particular area. So the darker browns are where there's a lot of consumption going on, a lot of consumption of food going on, and then the yellows are where there's less consumption. And you can see that it tracks fairly well with population density, but not perfectly. And that's because some people on this planet consume a lot more than other people per person. So this map is rough because it's just on a country-wide level, and it's a bit outdated because it doesn't have like North and South Sudan, for example, but you get the idea. The darker blues are where there's more consumption of food, of calories, per person, and the yellows and the lighter greens are where there's much less consumption per person. So, big surprise here. The biggest consumers are North America, Canada and the US, and Western Europe, okay? So, we consume a disproportionate amount of the world's resources. Therefore, you could probably argue with a lot of evidential backing that we are responsible for, we, as in the global north and specifically in the United States, are responsible for a lot of the Anthropocene or Anthroposphere. A lot of it's because of us. It's hard to make the case that Africa, for example, is a driving force behind the Anthropocene. There's not a lot of consumption of food there and other resources, and that region is, again, particularly vulnerable to biodiversity loss and water scarcity. This is a map here showing where crops and grazelands are, so not just crops, but also where we graze livestock for consumption. So you can see that a lot of these areas are more than 90% of the individual grid cells on this map are being used for one or the other crop or grazing or both. The yellow is both. So not only is there just a lot of farm and grazeland, rangeland across the world, but it's very intensively used. And that's because we have to feed 7.5 million people. And we have to feed a lot of greedy global northerners who are eating way more food than their global south counterparts. There's another big component to the Anthropocene, and that is our extraction and use of fossil fuels. So while they don't necessarily have as big of an imprint on the surface of the planet, they do have a large imprint on the climate of the planet, right, through global climate change. They have a big impact on the atmosphere and the environment and ecosystems, but they're a relatively small imprint on the surface of the Earth, right? So here's a map just showing some petroleum wells in Saudi Arabia. So oil is a huge driver of climate change and also the global economy. But you can see that on the actual land surface, oil wells are fairly small, okay? I don't really know what point I'm trying to make with this, but I think it's a worthwhile thing to sort of wrap our heads around, is how detrimental fossil fuel extraction has been for the globe and how important it is to consider when we're talking about the Anthropocene and the Anthroposphere. There's also a lot of oil left, but it's increasingly concentrated in like 20 countries. So you can see that it's concentrated here in the Middle East, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Canada, Russia, the U.S. has some, Venezuela has quite a bit, Nigeria, Libya, Norway, but that's about it. It kind of stops there. So you can see that of the top of all the oil left in 2006, 1,224.5 I'm not sure the units here, billion barrels, are concentrated in 20 countries, and only 68.1 billion barrels are in the rest of the whole world. Something else to consider. There's also a lot of shale oil, which is an unconventional type of oil, which is extracted through a process known as fracking. So there's shale oil and shale gas through a process known as fracking. Okay, and those basins are fairly widespread as well. Although there is a concentration of this potential shale oil and gas for extraction in the U.S., in Canada, and in Russia. Those seem to be the big sort of winners of the fracking race. So shale oil is an unconventional type of oil, shale gas and oil, and is extracted through fracking. There's going to be a lecture on fracking after this. So there's also a lot of coal. Coal is another fossil fuel that we use. So here's a map showing where all the coal is located across the planet. A lot of coal in the U.S., Russia, China, Australia, big coal deposits. Two different types of coal. There's lignite and anthracite or bituminous coal. They are extracted in similar yet different geologically different ways. Coal is a fairly dirty fossil fuel, and it's also at this point kind of expensive to extract versus newer methods of extraction like fracking, for example. So the use of coal is on the decline, actually, but it's being replaced by oil and gas that's fracked. What I want to hammer home about all this, about the Anthropocene and everything, is that we're not going to run out of fossil fuels. We just are not in enough time. We can't solve climate change by just waiting for us to run out of fossil fuels. Okay, so this graph here shows for oil, gas, and coal and conventional methods, the emissions that we have already emitted. This is in purple. The blue is what we think we still can extract, and then the yellow is what we think we could actually recover. So when you add it all up, there's a lot left. I mean, there's almost twice as much oil left as we've used, twice as much gas as what's left as what we've used, and almost 3 or 4 times as much coal as what we've used left. And that doesn't even consider these unconventional methods that we're now exploring with fracking and other things. So it's very dangerous to assume that we're going to run out of fossil fuels. That said, I'd like to end this on like a somewhat optimistic note, and so I do want to highlight 4 ways that humans can influence our planet, can affect the Anthropocene in potentially positive ways, and that is by harnessing energy from renewable sources. So here's a map showing all the potential global, worldwide wind energy that's available. So the red and the orange is like where there's a lot of wind energy. The yellow is like kind of a medium amount green. And then blue and light blue is where there's not a lot of potential for wind energy. So you can see that, first of all, offshore wind, so all along these coastlines, there's a lot of potentiality in offshore wind construction of windmills to generate wind electricity for renewable electricity generation. There's also a lot of potentiality for harnessing the energy from wind in regions that are flat and windy, like the Great Plains, or Western Russia, right? Or Northern Africa, for example, or the tip of South America, where there's quite a lot of wind. So there's a lot of potential in many regions across the globe for harnessing the power of wind to generate renewable electricity. And where there is not wind energy, there's the potential for harnessing energy from geothermal processes, namely earthquakes, volcanoes, that sort of thing, right? If we could harness the energy of that underground plate tectonics, we could supplement the wind energy and the other renewable energies with some of this geothermal energy potential. So you can see, of course, along the west coast in the Caribbean and the west coast of South America, anywhere that there's like a big plate margin, a big tectonic plate boundary, the Mediterranean and the Great African Rift here, and then of course Equatorial Asia and Tropical Asia here, the islands of the maritime continent. And where there's not wind and where there's not geothermal, there's the sun. And actually the sun and the wind graphs complement each other really well, right? So we have a lot of sun, of course, closer to the equator, so in Africa and the Middle East and Central America and South America and, of course, Australia. There's a lot of potential for harnessing the energy of the sun directly through solar panels or solar farms. And this graph pairs really nicely, I think, with the wind graph. So where there's wind, there's not always sun, but where there's sun, there's not always wind, and so we could complement each other with the two and fill in the gaps with geothermal energy and potentially wave energy. So obviously you're only going to get energy from waves if you're in a place where there are waves, aka the ocean. But there's a lot of potential for wave energy close to the poles. So I almost pointed at my computer. Up here, right, in southern Alaska and northern Europe and southern South America and southern Australia, there's a lot of potential energy that could be harnessed from waves. And those are places where there's not a lot of energy that could be harnessed from the sun because it's not that sunny up there, or the sun is not out for as long, right? It's dark in the winter, that sort of thing. So that could be supplemented with energy from the waves. So when you combine these four things, when you combine the wind, geothermal, the sun, and the waves, there absolutely is potential to replace our entire electrical grid with renewable sources. The technology is not the issue. The political will is the issue to get us here. So that is what I have as sort of an introduction to the Anthropocene. There's obviously a lot more that we can interrogate with the Anthropocene, but this is a good start. So that is the lecture for today.